y'all, do you like spam? I don't mean the lunch meat. I mean all of that junk email that you get from people that you are not interested in doing business with. Nobody likes spam, right? Well, good news. A number of countries around the world have instituted privacy regulations to protect us as consumers from all of that gross spam that we get in our inboxes, right? But as business owners, the tables are turned, and we are responsible for following those privacy regulations to make sure that we're not violating them. So today, we're going to talk about the Canadian anti-spam legislation, also known as CASL, pretty cool name, good job Canada, and how you can make sure that you are following the CASL requirements so that you're not in violation. So once again, CASL actually stands for Canadian Anti-Spam Legislation. And basically, it applies to any commercial electronic message, otherwise known as a CEM, that is sent to an electronic address. So an email address is absolutely considered an electronic address. SMS or text messaging from a marketing perspective, that sort of thing. We're going to talk about email specifically in this video because that's what I do. If you want to know more about requirements for SMS or text notifications, drop me a comment and I'm glad to do a video on those as well if there's enough interest. So these commercial electronic messages, yeah, we send them all the time, right? So why is this even a topic? Well, here's the thing. If you, whether your business is located in Canada or not, if you have communications, commercial electronic communications, that are sent to or received by someone who lives in Canada, you have to follow CASL guidelines. If you potentially have people on your email list, maybe you don't know, but if there's a possibility, it's really important that you go ahead and put these guidelines in place in your email program so you don't have to worry about it. The good thing is CASL and the CAN-SPAM regulation in the US and GDPR in the European Union, they're all pretty similar. So if you make sure you're following the three of those, you're going to be fine. But just so you know, violations for CASL can cost up to $1 million for an individual and up to $10 million for a business. So don't violate it. So CASL actually has three primary components. Now look, full disclaimer, I am not a legal expert. I'm certainly not a legal expert on the laws in Canada. So do not take this as legal advice. This is just sharing with you what I have learned over the years about the CASL regulation. I'm going to drop the link to the full text of the regulation in the description below. So make sure you check it out and read all the nuts and bolts to make sure that you're in compliance. But I'll hit the highlights. And that first highlight is about consent. So what CASL says is that you must obtain consent from a recipient acknowledging that they want to receive emails from you. Now, ideally, this consent would be explicit, meaning they very consciously and proactively indicated to you, either orally or verbally or through a form, that they wish to receive email. So from an email marketing perspective, what does that look like? Well, the easiest way to do this on an opt-in form for a lead magnet is to put a checkbox towards the bottom of the form that says, by checking this box, you are consenting to receive commercial or marketing emails from company name, right? That's all you have to do. Here is one very key piece of that. The checkbox must be unchecked by default. So they have to take, they being the subscriber, they have to take a proactive action to literally opt in to your lead magnet or whatever it is that your newsletter, whatever it is you're sharing, right? The box cannot be pre-checked because then they would be opting out. And the requirement is that they be able to opt in consciously. Okay? Just to make things easier on yourself, make sure all of your opt-in forms and order forms actually include a checkbox where they can confirm their consent to be communicated with by you. Now, I know some of us are still old school. Let's say that you have a clipboard by your cash register at your brick and mortar location, and you want to collect emails that way, which is still a legitimate way to do it. You could say collect business cards or something like that as well. If you go this route, which is fine, make sure you are stating explicitly that by putting their name on this list, they are consenting to receive marketing or commercial emails from you, or by putting their business card in this fishbowl, they are consenting to receive emails from you. Now, CASL also implies for implied consent or permission, which is a little bit grayer. There are a lot more details around implied or implicit consent or permission, so make sure you go down to the description and you read that in the actual text of the CASL regulation. But in general, CASL does allow for implied consent where some previous relationship between you and the recipient exists, even if they've not granted explicit permission by checking a box or whatever. So let's say that if I have purchased a product or service from you in the last 2 years, or if I have made an inquiry about products, goods, services, or land in the last 6 months, that can be considered implied consent. Those are really important dates to remember, right? Or time frames to remember. Also, for non-business relationships, implied consent can also be assumed if you are, say your organization is a registered charity or political organization, and I have made a donation to or I've volunteered with your organization in the last 2 years. So there are some wiggle room, we'll say, in implied consent, but make sure that if you are relying on implied consent, you are following all of the guidelines for that within CASL. I want to point this out because I think it's a really important thing, especially for those of us who are in sort of the internet marketing entrepreneurial world. Just because you are connected with someone on social media in Canada, that does not give you implied consent to communicate a commercial email to them or a commercial direct message even, right? We all get those DMs from somebody, like you friend somebody on Facebook and immediately they're in your DMs trying to sell you something. Not allowed under CASL because you, as the recipient, have not given your consent. This is not considered implied consent, just being connected with someone. So, my Canadian friends, use that to your advantage when people try to hit you up in DMs when you haven't asked for it. Also, this is an interesting point. Consent is really one of the primary differences between CASL and GDPR, which applies to the EU, and the CAN-SPAM regulation that applies to the US. Here in the US, consent is not a question. That is not part of our regulation. So, Canada, you're lucky. CASL is more restrictive, as is GDPR. So, err on the side of being more restrictive if you have folks who could potentially be joining your list from anywhere in the world, and go ahead and implement CASL and or GDPR regulations, their requirements rather, in your email marketing, in your opt-in forms and that kind of thing. So the second main component of CASL is going to seem kind of familiar if you know anything about CAN-SPAM. Now, one of the requirements of CAN-SPAM and of CASL is that you provide identification information about you or your company. Now, one of the biggest ways you do this is by including a mailing address that will be valid for at least 60 days following the receipt of any email that you send. Now, this varies a little bit in the US, but in Canada, P.O. boxes are considered valid mailing addresses for the purposes of CASL. So if you are someone who works from home, you are not required to put your home address as your mailing address. You can use a P.O. box. If you are in Canada and considering this option, make sure you read all of the fine print to make sure that you are going to use as your mailing address is valid. But in general, P.O. boxes are considered valid mailing addresses for the purposes of CASL. The third thing that we need to talk about, and this is probably the one that you're most familiar with, is you are required under CASL regulation to provide an unsubscribe mechanism. Now, we've all gotten emails where this unsubscribe mechanism was just about as hidden as you could get. One of the tricks is they'll put the unsubscribe text at the bottom with the link, and then they'll change the color of the link to the same color as the background of the email. Or they'll return a whole bunch at the bottom of the email, so the unsubscribe link is way, way, way down at the bottom where you're never going to scroll to see it, right? You cannot do that under CASL or any other regulation for that matter. It has to be a very obvious and clear unsubscribe link. Now, it doesn't officially have to say the word unsubscribe, but you should not obfuscate it with other verbiage that would make it unclear, right? You'll see a lot of people who will say things like, click here to manage your email preferences. As long as that is obvious, you are typically covered. However, I am on the side of making it as obvious as possible that this is the way you unsubscribe. Also, unsubscribing can't be this long, convoluted process where you have to log in and do this other stuff, right? It should be very, very simple. I actually remember years ago, before any of these regulations were in place, I was on the Oprah.com email list, and I had to log in to change my email preferences, and I could not remember how to log in. I'd completely lost all of my credentials. So I was unable to unsubscribe. That is not legal under these privacy regulations, particularly CASL. So make sure you're giving that unsubscribe link in a very obvious way. Now, I've got a couple of other videos about CAN spam in particular, and I'm going to do one for GDPR as well. So I will link those in the end cards and then in the description below so you can check those out. Again, these regulations apply to the recipient of your emails or other electronic communications, not where you are located. So even though I am located in the US, I have or could have people on my email list who live in Canada. Therefore, I am required to follow CASL regulations and GDPR regulations. So err on the side of following the more restrictive regulations and you'll be covered, because who wants a $10 million violation fine? Because I don't have that kind of dough in my pocket. Anyway, I hope this has been helpful. Check out the description below for all of the links you might need, including the full text of the CASL description. And I've also included an FAQ from the Canadian government that makes it a little bit easier to understand what they're talking about, in addition to some of those other videos that I've done on other regulations. So hope you enjoy it. Drop me a comment, subscribe, do all of those YouTube-y things, and we'll talk soon. Bye!